So what is the difference between almond flour and coconut flour in keto baking?
So this is a great question because there's a huge difference between almond flour and coconut flour when it comes to using them as a substitute for a traditional wheat flour or even your gluten-free flours. But let's focus on the difference between them and wheat flour, and then I'll get into a little bit more. So wheat flour has gluten, and gluten is what, if you make bread and you knead the dough, or if you've seen somebody make bread, you see them kneading the dough. They're developing the gluten because it's important to have the structure so that you get a good rise. There's yeast in there too. So with almond flour or coconut flour or any other grain-free flour, you're missing that gluten. So it's important to understand that before we get into the weeds here. So almond flour is going to measure cup for cup to regular flour. But coconut flour, 1/4 cup of coconut flour is equivalent to 1 cup of almond flour or regular flour. So almond flour is not at all absorbent. So almond flour is made from ground up almonds. And there's 3 or 4 different types of almond flour. The most commonly used one is one called blanched superfine almond flour. That's going to give you the most flour-like results in the end. The other ones have, if you see brown specks in them, that just means that the skins hadn't been removed. So the brown flecks are just the skins of the almond. So when you're looking at coconut flour, know that coconut flour is very highly absorbent. So there's a number of adjustments you have to make. If you're converting, let's say you found a keto recipe for waffles and you want to convert it from almond flour to coconut flour, or there's a couple additional conversions. So you already know that instead of using a cup of almond flour, you're going to use a 1/4 cup of coconut flour. But since coconut flour is so highly absorbent, you've also got to increase the eggs and the liquids in your recipe. Now, something like waffles is actually a great way to start because you can kind of see what happens to the batter. So when I teach cooking classes, I will actually make almond flour waffles and coconut flour waffles and demonstrate the difference between the two flours. Whenever you're baking with coconut flour, let it rest for a few minutes, stir it up, let it rest for a few minutes, or just stir it for 3 or 4 minutes and watch how it goes from like a runny batter to a very thick batter. So that's just a really good example to use. So of course there's all kinds of other keto flours to use. The other really important thing I want to mention before I end this question is whenever you're using almond flour or coconut flour or another keto flour, you want to make sure you're using some kind of a binder. Sometimes you'll find 2 or 3 binders in a recipe. So what do I mean by a binder? Well, these flours, if you just make them and convert a recipe and don't add anything, I've made cookies before that just fall apart. Like you scoop them up and they just fall apart. And that's because they're missing something to just hold the structure together. So you'll see xanthan gum in a lot of recipes, and that's what that's doing. The same goes for gelatin. Gelatin can give baked goods a chewier feel. You'll find gelatin in a lot of my cookie recipes. Actually, our keto bread recipe uses gelatin. Egg can also act as a binder. Cream cheese, mozzarella cheese. A lot of these things are actually acting as binders to hold things together.
Guar gum, tarragon.
Yeah, so there's other things, other gums like xanthan gum, guar gum, tarragon. He likes that one. We haven't tried tarragon yet. Glucoman is another one. And if you have a number of them at home, a fun little experiment to do is take a tablespoon of water and put it in some different containers and then mix in the different binders that you have. And you can observe how they react to the water. Now, xanthan gum and guar gum and glucoman are just going to make this weird jelly, gooey substance. But you'll start to understand and add about a 1/4 teaspoon to a tablespoon of water. You'll start to understand what's happening. And then repeat the experiment, but use fat. Use any oil, like olive oil, coconut oil, anything that's a liquid, and add that in. And it doesn't bind up.
Doesn't at all.
At all. So you can kind of play with them and start to understand. These are the types of experiments that I run when I'm creating recipes in my kitchen to make sure I have the right binding ratio or amount. So A little bit of these gums go a long way. If you ever end up with a baked good that has a stringy result, it could just be that you have too much of your binding agent in the recipe. So I hope that answered the question.